I stared at the corporate contract glowing on my monitor. My signature sat perfectly forged on the transfer line of my limited liability company. They were trying to sell my mosaic art intellectual property to a commercial developer for $850,000. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why my own flesh and blood would steal my life's work. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I picked up my phone and dialed my operations partner, Jordan. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was corporate fraud. For 28 years, my family treated me like a decorative accessory. While my sister Victoria climbed the corporate ladder in commercial real estate, I was just Ashley, the eccentric girl who played with broken glass and glue. My mosaic art was dismissed as a cute hobby, something to keep me busy while the real adults handled the serious business of making money. My parents funded Victoria's extravagant lifestyle, her luxury cars, and her downtown penthouse, constantly reminding me that art would never pay the bills and that I should learn to be more like my sister. They didn't know that 3 years ago, I structured my so-called hobby into a highly profitable, limited liability company. They didn't know that my operations partner Jordan and I had secured massive commercial commissions for high-end boutique hotels across the Pacific Northwest. I kept my financial success quiet because sharing it with my family only ever invited their condescension and unsolicited advice on how I should let Victoria manage my earnings. But 3 weeks ago, Victoria's real estate firm hit a brick wall. She had severely over-leveraged herself on a new luxury hotel development and desperately needed a unique selling proposition to secure her panicked investors. That's when she suddenly remembered my little hobby. Without my knowledge, she pitched my proprietary mosaic designs as the exclusive aesthetic for the entire hotel chain. When the investors demanded proof of intellectual property ownership, my family didn't come to me and ask. They didn't offer to buy the rights or negotiate a licensing contract. They simply took them. My father, who still had access to an old joint mailing address from my college days, intercepted my business mail. Together, they drafted a fraudulent transfer of ownership, forged my signature with terrifying accuracy, and presented my company as a subsidiary of Victoria's failing real estate empire. They exploited a vulnerability in the state's online business portal, utilizing an old, unmonitored verification email from my college days to bypass identity security protocols and electronically notarize the fraudulent transfer. They thought I wouldn't notice. They operated under the arrogant delusion that because I was an artist, I was financially illiterate and completely oblivious to corporate filings. But I reviewed my corporate ledger every single Friday. When I saw the unauthorized transfer request pending in the state database, I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, consistently paying the emotional overhead while they reaped the dividends of my compliance. Now, I realized our relationship had been a subscription, with me footing the bill for their egos, and it was time to cancel the service. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt entirely focused. They had crossed a distinct line from toxic family dynamics straight into federal offenses, and I was going to hold them fully accountable. Jordan arrived at my studio exactly 12 minutes after I called. We didn't waste time on emotional venting or wondering how my parents could be so callous. We sat at the long wooden table where I usually sketched my mosaic patterns, but today we were drafting an entirely different kind of masterpiece. We pulled every piece of documentation we had: original copyright registrations for my designs, the time-stamped metadata of the forged transfer documents, and the digital footprints tracing the fraudulent state filing directly back to Victoria's Real Estate Office Internet Protocol address. They're signing the final investor agreement on Friday morning at the new hotel site, Jordan said, his eyes scanning the intercepted emails we'd legally recovered through our corporate attorney. They're using your intellectual property portfolio as collateral to secure a $3 million funding round. If that ink dries, the bank will have a legal claim to your designs as liquidated assets, making it an absolute nightmare to untangle your ownership from her inevitable bankruptcy. I nodded, my pulse perfectly steady. There was no hesitation in my chest. I didn't entertain fleeting thoughts of calling my parents to demand a tearful apology. Apologies are for broken promises, not broken laws. I instructed our attorney to immediately file an emergency injunction to halt the intellectual property transfer and prepare the civil litigation. But we didn't serve them quietly in a private office. Serving them quietly wouldn't balance the ledger. My family had built their entire identities on public perception, social standing, and corporate prestige. If they were going to leverage my life's work to save their sinking ship, they were going to face the consequences in front of the very investors they were attempting to defraud. Over the next 48 hours, I worked with absolute clinical precision. We immediately restricted their access to all joint business portals and established a temporary escrow account to sequester our operating funds, effectively walling off our assets from their reach. I contacted the lead investor of Victoria's hotel project through a secure corporate channel, requesting an urgent compliance review meeting for Friday morning, precisely 1 hour before their scheduled signing ceremony. I didn't make emotional pleas about my treacherous sister. I provided them with a flawless forensic accounting of the intellectual property theft. I spoke their language, risk mitigation, fraud exposure, and severe liability. My mother called me twice on Thursday afternoon. She left voicemails asking if I wanted to come to a casual family dinner on Sunday, her voice dripping with that familiar, patronizing sweetness. She was just checking the temperature, making sure I was completely oblivious, keeping the naive artist distracted while they quietly sold her canvas. I listened to the voicemails with a cold detachment. They weren't going to be shocked by what they'd done. They were going to be shocked that I'd finally stopped playing along. The trap was meticulously set, not out of malice, but out of necessity. This was the final audit of a bankrupt relationship, and I was ready to collect. Friday morning arrived with crisp, biting air. The hotel development site was bustling with catered breakfast displays, crystal champagne flutes, and executives in tailored suits. The corporate attorneys were already seated at the massive mahogany table, checking their watches as the ceremony was about to begin. Victoria stood at the center of the marble atrium, basking in the glow of her supposed triumph. My parents flanked her, beaming with the kind of absolute pride they had never once directed at me. They were minutes away from signing the contract that would illegally bind my mosaic company to their debt-ridden enterprise. Jordan and I walked through the heavy glass doors precisely at 10 o'clock. We didn't shout, we didn't make a scene. We walked with the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute leverage. I bypassed the greeting table and walked directly toward Victoria. When she saw me, her triumphant smile faltered, replaced instantly by a mask of condescending annoyance. "Ashley, what are you doing here?" Victoria hissed, taking a quick step away from her investors. "This is a closed corporate event. You need to leave before you embarrass us." "I know it is," I said, my voice barely above a conversational volume, yet carrying cleanly across the quiet floor. "I'm here to audit the transaction." My father stepped forward, his face flushing deep red. "Ashley, go home right now. We will deal with whatever tantrum you are throwing later." I didn't look at him. I looked directly at the lead investor, the man who had already reviewed my forensic file that morning. I handed Victoria a thick, bound folder. "This is a formal cease and desist order regarding the unauthorized commercial use of my intellectual property. Behind it is the filed injunction against the fraudulent transfer of my limited liability company. And behind that is the official notice of pending criminal charges for forgery and corporate fraud." Victoria dropped the folder as if it were burning. The papers spilled onto the polished floor, exposing the highlighted signature analysis. Her investors immediately stepped back, creating a physical distance that perfectly mirrored their sudden financial withdrawal. My mother turned pale, frantically trying to snatch the folder from my hand, her hands trembling as she hissed, "Don't do this, Ashley! You're destroying our reputation!" "It's just family business. We were going to cut you in once the hotel launched and the profit stabilized." I didn't blink. "Family business doesn't involve forging signatures on state documents," I replied, my tone entirely devoid of emotion. "You never intended to cut me in, you intended to render me obsolete. Now you'll be dealing with the consequences of that choice." The lead investor cleared his throat, looking at Victoria with absolute disdain. "We are putting this signing on immediate hold. Our legal team will be in touch with you, Victoria, regarding these disclosures. Until then, this funding is frozen." Victoria collapsed into a nearby chair, the reality of her ruined empire crashing down around her. My parents stood frozen, their perfectly curated public image shattering in real time. There was no screaming match. There was no tearful confrontation. I simply turned around and walked out into the sunlight with Jordan. The ledger was officially closed. The massive debt was settled. The fallout was swift and absolute. Without the critical investor funding, Victoria's real estate firm filed for bankruptcy within the month. The state launched a formal investigation into the forged documents, leading to criminal fraud charges that left my family buried under a mountain of legal fees. My parents had to sell their expansive home to cover the mounting costs, moving into a small, rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. Their wealthy social circle, the one they had spent their entire lives trying to impress and appease, vanished the moment the corporate fraud became public knowledge in the local business journals. Meanwhile, my mosaic business expanded exponentially. Jordan and I secured the hotel aesthetic contract directly with the investors who had walked away from my sister. We opened a second massive studio space downtown and hired 3 new full-time artists. I was no longer the girl who played with broken glass. I was the chief executive officer of a thriving commercial enterprise. I changed my phone number, updated my estate planning to ensure my assets were protected, and completely severed all ties with my biological family. I didn't do it out of lingering anger. I did it because maintaining any connection with them was a severe liability I could no longer afford. Yet, as I sit in my new studio today, surrounded by the vibrant colors of shattered glass coming together to form something beautiful and enduring, I realize that the most profound change didn't happen in my bank account or my corporate structure. It happened in my heart. For years, I had secretly craved their validation, twisting myself into knots, trying to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of seeing it. I'd allowed their skewed perception of me to dictate my own internal value. I've come to realize that some ledgers can never be balanced, no matter how much you pay into them or how hard you try to make the numbers work. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free from the heavy anchor of their expectations. I don't harbor hatred for my family anymore. Hatred requires an emotional investment, and I've reallocated all my emotional capital back into myself. I forgave them not by welcoming them back into my life, but by completely releasing my desperate need for their approval. I took the broken pieces of my past, the betrayal, the dismissals, the cold realities, and I arranged them into a foundation of undeniable strength. I am whole, I am successful, and I am entirely my own.